for coming to our panel. Hi, Sandra. I am Brenda Miller, and I'm coming to you from Bellingham, Washington, which is on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin throughout the San Juan Islands and the North Cascades watershed from time immemorial. And our panel is called The Nature of Time and the Time of Nature in Creative Nonfiction. And I'm just going to read to you the panel description because I know we might not have those right in front of us on Hop-In. Time may seem to be a fixed construct, but the nature of time in creative nonfiction can be expressed in diverse ways depending on our cultural background, our experience, the forms we choose to use, and the points of view we inhabit. Human time, for example, can look quite different than time experienced in natural settings. Indigenous cultures often have perceptions of time experienced differently than the time frames of colonizers. During these years of the pandemic, time has taken on another dimension altogether. In this panel, 5 experienced writers of creative nonfiction explore how time is navigated in their work and the work of others. So during the year of the pandemic, I found myself uttering the phrase, "What is time anyway?" Usually with a breezy laugh and a wave of my hand. This sentence usually comes in conversation when none of us can remember when something happened or in marveling at how long we've been in a state of suspended animation. And while I mean it to be a joke, I realize I do actually mean it. I kind of want to know, what is time anyway? And what is our relationship to time when writing about our own lives and the lives of others? The notion of time even came to the forefront as we prepared for this conference, as many of you probably experienced, just trying to do the math constantly in my head so that I wouldn't be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And all of us are coming together from different places in time, which just kind of gives me a brain cramp. Vladimir Nabokov, in his memoir, Speak Memory, dismisses the notion of time altogether. He says, "I confess I do not believe in time. I like to fold my magic carpet after use in such a way as to superimpose one part of the pattern upon another. Let visitors trip." In effect, we are time traveling when we write about memories or experiences, and we're not relegated to just the past tense. We can avail ourselves of past, present, future, and not necessarily in that order. So in this panel, 4 other writers will address time and how time functions in writing from different perspectives. I'll introduce them now in the order that they will appear. So Kristiana Kahakauwila is a Hopa writer of Kanaka, Maoli, German, and Norwegian descent. Her book, This is Paradise, Stories, is set in contemporary Hawaii. She is an assistant professor at University of Hawaii at Manoa and faculty in the low residency MFA at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe. Toni Jensen's Carrie is a memoir and essays about gun violence, land, and Indigenous women's lives. An NEA Creative Writing Fellowship recipient in 2020, Jensen's essays have appeared in Orion, Catapult, and Ecotone. She teaches at the University of Arkansas and the Institute of American Indian Arts. She is Metis. Susan Olding is the author of Big Reader and Pathologies, A Life in Essays. Her work has appeared widely in journals and anthologies, including the Bellingham Review, Mason Nuev, I'm not sure how to pronounce that one, Susan, and the Utne Reader. She is a PhD candidate in cultural studies at Queen's University, and she teaches in the University of Victoria's Department of Writing. And Rebecca Beardsall is the author of My Place in the Spiral. Her work has appeared in Swim, West Texas Review, Two Cities Review, Schuylkill Valley Journal, Thimble, and Poetry New Zealand, among others. She is the nonfiction editor at Minerva Rising Press. So again, oh, hi, Rebecca. Good to see you. Oh, wait, we have more and more people here. Hi, Laura. All right, so we're going to now turn it over to Kristiana.
Thank you, Brenda. Aloha mai kako. I'm coming to you from Honolulu in Hawaii. And I'm just gonna, oh, I know what I need to do. I have to share my screen so you can see some images along the way. Fabulous. It's always nice when it works. All right. A couple years ago, while mentoring a student in the low residency MFA at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, I was struck by the structure of her novel in progress. Her manuscript didn't trace onto a linear plot line in the least, yet felt organic to the themes and characters of her work. Her novel had what I called then a nodule structure, these discrete moments that began in a similar rooted memory and then looped outwards, exploring a new moment in time before returning to their central idea. For a novel about trauma, memory, generational violence, and survivance, this looping structure resonated with the purpose and meaning of the narrative. I asked my student, how had she come upon this structure, and how did she know it was the right one? She told me that the structure began intuitively, but that her mentor, the previous term, had helped her identify and articulate the pattern so that she could continue to purposely write into it. That mentor is my fabulous peer on this panel, Toni Jensen. Toni had wisely recognized that our student was employing an Anishinaabe flower petal design. Our student, who is Anishinaabe, was writing her book following a visual structure she had grown up observing. Her temporal model was based on the beaded floral motifs that had surrounded her at home and in her culture. In Jane Allison's literary criticism / craft book, Meander, Spiral, Explode, Design and Pattern in Narrative, Allison argues that writers are naturally pattern makers. She says, we writers go about our observing, imagining lives, moving onward day by day, but always alert to patterns, ways in which experience shapes itself, ways we can replicate its shape with words. Later, Allison adds, although we think of narrative as a temporal art experienced in time like music, of course, it's interestingly visual too. Reading Allison's argument highlighted for me something that I was already understanding about my own crafting. Story structure was, in fact, always had been linked to the visual. While sometimes I envisioned a story structure as a pattern or shape, more and more I looked for an object to become my structural touchstone. In a braided essay titled Marked, about my best friend's death from cancer at 30, and cacao, or tattoo, an essay that is also about claiming identity, Albert Wentz tattooing the post-colonial body, and breath, I begin with the image of an airplane, a trick pilot drawing loops in the sky, which my best friend and I watched on our final day together. The object of the plane and its vapor trail is not only thematic, planes and vapor reappearing throughout the essay, but also a kind of vessel for holding and moving through time. Allison organizes the chapters in Meander, Spiral, Explode by structural pattern, identifying each via nature imagery. For the spiral narrative, she instructs the reader to think of a fiddlehead fern, whirlpool, hurricane, or chambered nautilus. For a radial or explosion, she references petals growing from a daisy's heart. Meanders are a snake in motion. Branching and other fractal patterns can be spotted in trees and coastlines. Cellular patterns are the repeated shapes of honeycomb or the foam of bubbles. Even linear plotline can be seen in a wave. In other words, Allison sees temporal structures in nature's shapes and patterns. But I want to argue that for the contemporary Indigenous writer, nature is not enough. Our narrative temporal vessels may be rooted in nature's production, but also must spring from cultural productions that hold meaning to us. In Elizabeth DeLowry's critical essay, The Spiral Temporality of Patricia Grace's Potiki, which I know Rebecca's going to mention as well, she talks about time and structure in Grace's groundbreaking 1985 novel. DeLowry writes about how Potiki disrupts the linear novel, reforming the individualistic narrative into a communal Maori narration of spiral time, rather than segregating the past time of the ancestors from the present time of the contemporary community. Grace employs a spiral temporality where past and future is narratively re-experienced in what she terms the now time, centered in the being. In this way, the novel mediates between polarized positions regarding Indigenous historiography, choosing to avoid a reclamation of a pre-contact Indigenous essence by positioning a complex post-cultural Maori community. The spiral pattern in the novel then is temporal, structural, decolonial, and literal. It calls to mind natural shapes, that of the koru or unfurling frond, as well as ocean waves. But it also directly references Maori kowhaiwhai. These are elaborately scrolled or painted curvilinear designs that are similar to the spirals of the Maori moko, tattooing, the wood-carved prow of canoes, and hei tiki. All of these embodiments of spiral time appear throughout Grace's novel, resonant objects as well as vessels of community. Yes, these scrolling shapes are tied to natural forms, but more importantly, they are relational forms. Painted on the ridgepole, the kowhaiwhai represents the whakapapa of the iwi. Floral beading techniques passed down through generations are reminders of Anishinaabe survivance and innovation. In other words, the most important temporal vessels are relational vessels, just as the most important stories are acts of relationship. My father is David Kahakauwila. My mother is Nancy Loy Kahakauwila. I'm Hapa, of Kanaka Maoli, Norwegian, and German descent. My father descends from Chief Kahakauwila of Maui and the Nyoles of Big Island. My mother's grandparents were settlers on Mandan land in what is now the state of North Dakota. I grew up in Long Beach, California, on the homelands of the Tongva. Because my father worked for freight airlines, my parents and I were able to fly to Hawaii with regularity. And so I grew up in close relationship with my cousins and aunties and uncles in the land of Maui, my ancestral land. And yet I felt then, as I do now, that I was often shorebound. In my childhood home, I gazed west to Hawaii. When on Maui, my ancestral home, I gazed east to the North American continent. Even now, having moved back to Honolulu, yet again, but with my parents living still in Long Beach, my sense of self is laced with the twinned feeling of belonging and longing for. My current nonfiction, a very slowly growing body of essays, is interested in this twinned sensation, one that I suspect anyone who has grown up in diaspora feels, one that I know my friends returning home from diasporic communities feel. What does it mean to mesh more than one culture inside the self, more than one place, more than one idea of family, of nature, of time? In his essay, We Are the Ocean, the wonderful Tongan Fijian anthropologist and writer Apele Hauofa writes, the people of the island of Tana and Vanuatu conceive of their universe in terms of the tree and the canoe. The tree symbolizes rootedness in culture, while the canoe stands for movements across sea routes that connect the people of different island locations. The canoe is history, the working out of relationships established through travel and movement of materials from one island to another. One may extend this metaphor to include present-day connections between Oceania and the surrounding continental landmasses and cultures. One may even say that since it is made of wood, the canoe is part of the tree, and its potentials are to a large extent determined by the qualities of the tree from which it was made. Oh, Hauofa. He, like Grace, like Toni, reminds me that the nature of time is rooted in our understanding of it. Time is a cultural production, and for an Indigenous writer, it must be rendered as such, a vessel produced, crafted to carry generations rather than minutes or years. These days, as I write about my most recent return to Hawaii, about my daughter's birth and our decision to raise her here on my ancestral land, as well as my mother's recent cancer diagnosis, I try to make sense of the movements that have defined my life, of the temporal spans between my birth and my daughter's, between my father's departure from Hawaii and my return. Generations ago, my ancestors set out in sailing canoes. What are airplane wings if not horizontal sails? What is vapor if not echoes of whitecaps on the sea? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Oh, that was beautiful seeing those images. I meant to say too in the chat, we will be doing the Q&A at the end via the chat. You can go ahead and put questions in as you think of them, but I'm worried they might get buried in the chat. So you could also just save it until we're at that point. All right. So Rebecca, would you be ready to go next?
I think so.
Oh, yay. That sounds good.
Okay, good. Well, I'm so excited to be part of a discussion and panel about time and narrative. I continually return to the fluidity of time and its complexity. And as someone who enjoys working with and investigating patterns, so much of what I love to do is woven deeply in the notion of time. In the mid-90s, I married a New Zealander and had the privilege of living in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where the spiral, as Tiana mentioned, is always around us throughout our day. My first experience with spiral time, however, was in novels by Maori authors, one being Patricia Grace's Potiki. To also bring in a quote that Tiana just mentioned, that Elizabeth Delogre, in her essay, The Spiral Temporality of Patricia Grace's Potiki, states, rather than segregating the past time of the ancestors from the present time of the contemporary community, Grace employs the spiral temporality, where past and future time is narratively re-experienced in what she terms the now time, centered in the being. Grace's novel posits a secret spiral time that has political, cultural, and social responsibilities as a decolonial telling. Delugre also states, quote, the spiral gestures to the past while moving into the future, positioning historical events in the present so that time becomes simultaneous, end quote. And the simultaneous is what is so powerful about the spiral, that we are able to be our past, our history, and also here and now. As Grace would say, now time. First-person retrospective narratives, nonfiction narratives, might naturally follow the spiral. A spiral, a symbol indicating the voyage into one's inner self. A spiral goes on forever. It's unending. It can be more than a narrative tool into a journey into oneself and one's obsession. It can also be a real movement of time, a fluid way of moving into the past and back to the future and lingering in the present. For most Westerners, time is viewed as linear, pushing the past behind and looking forward to the future. This is the dominant narrative of the United States and in American culture, which I was raised. I recently was listening to a podcast on being with an interview with Kate Bowler. And Kate writes about a stage 4 cancer diagnosis at the age of 35 in her memoir, Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved. In the interview, Ballard states, quote, "There's a desire to really skip to the end. And in the end, you know, especially if you believe that hope is a story about you, then hope means that the end of the story is always good. And therefore you can read backwards and everything there for is supposed to be wrapped up." She continues, "And then there's all the people who live in the past. And Americans, of course, don't ever live in the past because they're very committed to the no regrets as a philosophy. This is a country that really just is so convinced that if they look backwards, they would surely turn to sand." End quote. Ballard's statement made me laugh when I heard it the first time. The turning to sand if they look backwards was the culture I was raised in. But from a young age, I was always interested in the past, the stories of my family and of the place around me. I was connected to a time that no one wanted to focus on. During my time in Aotearoa, New Zealand, I realized my way of looking at time wasn't unusual. Instead, it was just different from my culture's understanding of time or willingness to look at, let alone acknowledge, the past. A strict adherence to linear time separates us from our ancestors and ignores the actions of the past and their consequences. So how does someone who is a settler and non-Indigenous still step into that spiral? The spiral forces us to look into the past. It doesn't presuppose a victorious end. It asks us to reconnect to our ancestors across time and space and to understand the relational histories. In my memoir, My Place in the Spiral, where I investigate my connection to my maternal line, a deep dive into the lives of my Nana and great-grandmother, women I never met, but who I later realized paralleled my life, I use a phrase sequence throughout my book to mirror this spiraling and spin and movement of time. I am here, I once was here, I will return here, the here always remains. My memoir is hybrid, where I use images and footnotes to investigate my story, much like the way you learn about yourself through opening a box of family photos and ephemera. The narrative follows a spiral, and within the space I address how my life is part of a spiral. One section in my book, I continue to search for answers. I look for my Nana in her Bible that my mom sent me in the mail. I read passages where she had bookmarks. I find four-leaf clovers pressed within those pages. I read those pages for some meaning. I study the content of the bookmarks. One being a magazine clipped out of about victory gardens, and just trying whatever I could to bring Ruth to me. And in that moment, I see something and it causes me to stop. And I'm just going to read that section right now. Frustrated by the false hope of information on a victory garden, I flipped the page over. The first thing I noticed was the picture of two men, a section on farmers. I'm curious now where Nana found this article. Was it in one of those farming chronicles, papers, magazines that used to be around our house too? We used to have a stack in the basket in the bathroom. My eyes scanned the page again. Zealand Farms rested at the cut edge and my heart jumped. The new left in the void, removed by the scissor blade, but I know it was there. A word my eyes are trained to see. New Zealand, Aotearoa. The past reached out to the future. What are the chances that Nana would cut out an article on spiritual gardening and on the back of the page, not regarded or valued in the cutting, would keep the remnants of the name of a country her granddaughter moved to and considers home? Yes, as Didion mentioned, I was searching for symbols, but this seemed a little too coincidental to just walk away from it. A clear connection through time, I'd say, and New Zealand being the reason I even know about the spiral of time, a non-linear understanding of time, which I discovered in narratives without knowing the terminology in novels by Maori authors. Now, here in this moment, New Zealand pulled me back to the page clipped out of a magazine by Ruth. A spiral narrative provides a space to allow for fluidity of time while forming never-ending movement around an obsession, an inner quest, a familiar connection, making it a form that lends itself to nonfiction and memoir. And as someone who's obsessed with the way that time works, I continually return to the spiral format in my writing, and as a way to connect to my past, my ancestors, the land in which I live, and our stories. Thank you.
Oh, Rebecca, that just gave me chills. Much more than a coincidence, for sure. Thank you. Next up, we'll have Toni Jensen.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for pulling this panel together, Brenda and Susan, Rebecca, Tiana. It's so lovely to be here with you. And thanks to all of you for showing up today. I saw some of you in the chat who are familiar to me, so special thanks to you for showing up on your mornings or afternoons or evenings. I guess it's kind of good to have a panel like this across so many time zones. I may be the only one on the panel in Central Time too, I'm not sure. But yeah, I'm coming to you from Arkansas. I teach at the University of Arkansas here at the edge of the Ozarks. I sit right now on Osage land, Cherokee land, plenty of other tribes as well. Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard is just a few blocks away, and that was formerly known as the Trail of Tears. And before that, that land, of course, that road was just a road, it was a safe way of passage before it became known as the Trail of Tears, and now Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. Excuse me. And that's something that comes up a lot in my book, Carrie, what a place was, what it was called, who called it that, what it is now. And so I'm going to talk a little bit today about time and timeliness during the writing of the book. I finished my book right as COVID was starting to lock the world down. It was published into the world of COVID and the pandemic and lockdown. And everyone, I think, has been questioning time in ways that some of us maybe long have questioned time. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So I titled this, When Was That? Where Was That? Who Are We Again? During the last 2.5 years, people the world over seem to be reconfiguring our ideas about time and seasons. Locally, where I live in the United States, at the edge of the region known as the Ozarks, I'm finding both time and seasons have been both expanded and cleaved. During the pandemic, especially at the beginning, but even now, I found myself thinking of time in a different way, perhaps than before, or at least I began to think more formally about time and days and movement. So during the pandemic, I saw each day as a 4-part day of its own. So morning became the first day, followed by day 2, which had formerly been known as the afternoon, and day 3 comprised of the evening hours, and then the blessed day 4, the sleeping day. For others, I heard time move differently, one day flowing like water into the next, then weeks behaving similarly, then months, and now even years. When was that? We ask each other about a baby's birth, a friend's divorce, a book release, even a funeral. It may be for me that my mind's insistence on this 4-day structure had to do with the ways in which I was carving up my time, book promotion, writing, teaching for both universities, and then family. It may be the changes in our environment due to climate crisis also pushed me to think of time this way as well. For example, when I first moved to the Ozarks 8 years ago, we still had 4 distinct seasons. Nature governed my patterns as much as anything else. I could count on the leaves leaving the trees in the fall, ice and some snow each winter, rain in spring and early summer, the humid thick excuse me, of June and July steaming over into warm rain each August. As an Indigenous woman, a Northerner, a Métis woman, I'm already far out of time and place living in the American South. The rhythms of place and weather and time affect my thinking and my writing more than just about anything else. Though I admire very much the mindset and skill it takes to write nonfiction from far in the past or to imagine our world far into the future, I'm most interested in situating the now in proximity to the natural world and the policies of the more recent past, say of the last few hundred years. Geologic time, the far history, holds some appeal as constant, of course, until it doesn't. Until the trees hold their leaves in December, until winter temperatures locally stretch toward 80 degrees Fahrenheit. It's almost 80 degrees today here, which is insanity. Until there's no August rain, but warm rain in the wintertime. Until all recognizable patterns have fallen, much like the singularity of any given day. How then to write about our present day changing? How to write about something that happens in part one of our 4-part days, aka morning, amidst the unmooring of our world's patterns? How to create in our writing rhythms and patterns in image and language that evoke both the necessary stability for a reader to enter our work and also to work toward providing some beauty, some touch point that seems like stability. In my writing, I find myself increasingly trusting the rules I create for myself versus the rules that once perhaps existed about time or temporality and even about place. Though I find it much easier to suspend time and its rules than to suspend the rules or order of a given place, our ever-changing physical world is pushing me to embrace those physical shifts as well. What choice do we have other than to chronicle these shifts, to participate? When I was writing my book, Carrie, a memoir of survival on stolen land, I often structured essays or chapters according to place rather than to time period. The book follows a trajectory rather than a firm chronology, and that trajectory or arc is made up of places as much as it is moments. Several times, for example, I wrote about where I live at the edge of the Ozarks in Northwest Arkansas because something happened or had happened that fit thematically or in other ways with the place. Those moments when Arkansas became interwoven with events in other places caused me to think more about linkages and less about discreteness or separation. Also, I'm Métis, and so I think of things, as Tiana was saying before, in terms of petals, in terms of connection. So for me, thinking of writing these essays and this book as a petal narration meant the core of the petal was gun violence, because that was the linking material. That's uncomfortable to think about petal or flower in that sort of a violent way. And so then I had to distance myself a little from that analogy, and I started to think of place as the common denominator, because gun violence and petals and flowers, it just didn't quite work for me as an analogy. So that petal narration persisted, but I had also to think about how our common American gun violence project was really the link, and land and place and going back to the beginning of time, those were really the links. Several times, for example, when I wrote about gun violence from the founding of the United States to present day, how I proceeded through time had to do much less with chronology than with these patternings. I know I was onto something with patterning, that a relevant pattern was forming when I could see the present day moments links with the past. In order to see these links, to make them, and to trust their efficacy, one must be open to seeing the shifts we're undergoing right now. One must be present enough to catalog the present and to hold the gifts of the past as gifts or opportunities rather than only as trauma or history. And one place where I found this was easier to do than others, Tiana mentioned North Dakota, and that was what I had planned to read a little from Carrie from the beginning part, which is set in North Dakota, just the first few pages, and then to talk just for a minute or two about how geologic time does factor in and how jumping time and place factors in. So this is from the first chapter, Women in the Fracklands, section 1. On Magpie Road, the colors are in riot. Sharp blue sky over green and yellow tall grass that rises and falls like water in the North Dakota wind. Magpie Road holds no magpies, only robins and crows. A group of magpies is called a tiding, a gulp, a murder, a charm. When the men in the pickup make their first pass, they are on the road. You are photographing the grass against sky, an ordinary bird blurring over a lone rock formation. You do not photograph the men, but if you had, you might have titled it Father and Son Go Hunting. They wear camouflage and their mouths move in animation or argument. They've left their windows down as you have left those in your own car down the road. It is warm for fall. It's grouse season and maybe partridge, but not yet waterfowl. Despite how partridge are in the lexicon vis-a-vis pear trees and holiday singing, the birds actually make their homes on the ground. You know which birds are in season because you're from Iowa, another rural place where guns and men and shooting seasons are part of the knowledge considered common. Magpie Road lies in the middle of the 1,028,051 acres that make up the Little Missouri National Grasslands in western North Dakota. Magpie Road lies about 200 miles north and west of the Standing Rock Reservation, where thousands of Indigenous people and their allies have come together to protect the water, where sheriff's men and pipeline men and National Guardsmen have been donning their riot gear, where those men still wait, where they still hold tight to their riot gear. If a man wears his riot gear during prayer, will the sacred forsake him? If a man wears his riot gear to the holiday meal, how will he eat? If a man enters the bedroom in his riot gear, how will he make love to his wife? If a man wears his riot gear to tuck in his children, what will they dream? Magpie Road is part of the Bakken, a shale formation lying deep under the birds, the men in the truck, you, this road. The shale has been forming over millions of years through pressure, through layers of sediment becoming silt. The silt becomes clay, which becomes shale. All of this is because of water. The Bakken is known as marine shale, meaning once here, instead of endless grass, there lay endless water. So I tried in the book to think of how the places that I inhabit were the same. The birds were the same. There was continuity. And I think that's important when we're talking about time and temporality and shifting seasons and climates and places, to think about the constants, the things that stay the same. And I get asked pretty often why there are so many birds in this book. And for me, the birds were the constants. There have been birds. There will be birds. I know with climate crisis, that's not entirely a given, but the birds are meant to carry the news of the day. They're meant to carry the weather. They're meant to carry the seeds from one place to the next. And so for me, thinking about time, whether it's the morning, the first day of the day, the second day, the afternoon, the third day, the evening, the fourth day of sleep, the birds will still be doing bird things in the trees, in the fields, during the riots, protests in North Dakota, I mean, wherever we are. And so I wanted to talk a little about how that patterning happens as part of nature, but it also changes as nature changes. And as writers of nonfiction, we need to be chronicling, I feel like, those sorts of changes, as well as being sure we're paying attention to the patterns that still exist. So that's a little about what I wanted to say. And thank you again.
Oh, so wonderful. Wow, it's such a powerful passage you read, Toni. Thank you. All right. And now Susan Olding will wrap up the more formal part, and then we'll have more of a conversation among us and open it up to questions from the audience. Susan?
Yeah, thank you so much, Brenda, and thank you all. It's so interesting to hear the resonances between these different talks. I'm just thrilled to be a part of this group, and thank you all for coming. I'm speaking to you from Lekwungen and Saanich territory, Coast Salish territory, Victoria, BC. So just a little north of where Brenda is. And I've titled my little talk, Essaying the Space-Time Continuum. The other day, I asked my third-year nonfiction class to map Virginia Woolf's street haunting. I borrowed the exercise from Julia Schukees, who warned me the students would find it difficult. She was right. They'd already read Tim Bascom's Picturing the Personal essay and had practiced mapping a shorter piece. But as I walked around the room to check how things were going, I kept hearing, "Wait, how are we supposed to do this? She's always jumping back and forth in time." One student put her finger on the passage that seemed to encapsulate the problem. Is the true self this which stands on the pavement in January, or that which bends over the balcony in June? Am I here or am I there? Am I here or am I there? A question I echo as I sit in North America talking to some of you who are an ocean and a day away. I'm not a mathematician nor a physicist, and I don't understand the theory of relativity. But as reader and writer, I'm intuitively aware of space-time as a four-dimensional manifold. To take but one example, all experienced writers understand that white space on a page can invite a reader to slow her pace, even to pause. We also know how an extended scene can feel to a reader as if it's taking place in real time or slow motion, and how, on the other hand, a summary fast forwards a narrative. We know, too, how to manipulate syntax to create specific rhythms. The periodic sentence that takes up half a page will build suspense and prolong thought, while the fragment stops a reader short. Virginia Woolf was, of course, the queen of that kind of control, and Street Haunting offers a striking example of how the essay as a form both reflects and magnifies the complex interpenetration of space and time. Until a few years ago, I lived in Kingston, a small city situated at the junction of Lake Ontario, the St. Lawrence River, and the Rideau Canal. Kingston was the first settler colonial capital of Canada. And though it lost that designation in 1843, it still boasts some magnificent early 19th century architecture. The house we lived in, a faux Georgian stucco, 2 up, 2 down, was built around 1840 for someone who might have worked at one of the big breweries or at the nearby docks. In Kingston, the bells of the Anglican Cathedral still toll the hours. I heard those bells as I ran from work to home, from home to the grocer, from the grocer to the daycare, from the daycare to the station, where I'd regularly catch a train to go visit my ailing parents. In that period of my life, juggling different jobs, caring for a challenging child, an ornery cat, and my parents at a distance, I always seemed to be rushing. I kept trying to save time, or borrow time, or bank time, or steal time. Time wore the Janus face it must have worn for the city's 19th century merchants. It was all pervasive, yet strictly limited, inescapable, yet always running away from me. Things changed when I moved to the West Coast. I arrived on Vancouver Island just as COVID restrictions came into effect. You can guess what happened then. Time stopped. Then it dragged. Eventually, my family and I established some new routines, and as each identical day merged into the next, time seemed to disappear. With nowhere to rush to, I looked around, looked up, and felt a shift in scale as dramatic as the shift in my perception of time. The trees here grew so much taller than trees in the East. Even after almost 2 centuries of rapacious logging, many were older than the oldest buildings. And there were more of them, far more than there are people. Their scent permeated the air. Their branches sighed and moaned in the wind. Their roots probed deep into the soil. They were living, breathing, speaking reminders that to measure time exclusively in human terms is harmful and misguided. Big Reader, the book I wrote during my Kingston years, looks over its shoulder across the Atlantic to Scotland and England, the places my ancestors fled for the colonies. It looks into the past, my own past in part, but also the literary past. I visit Keats' house, a 2 up, 2 down, much like my home in Kingston. I learn about the neurobiology of reading with the aid of Charles Dickens. I invoke the ghosts of George Eliot and Doris Lessing, and even Virginia Woolf. Big Reader includes collage or mosaic style essays where the past appears side by side in a different panel but on the same plane as the present. It includes essays written in the present tense as if they're taking place in the now, when really the events they relate happened a long time ago. It includes braided essays where the past or multiple pasts intermingle and coexist with the present and the future, and essays that circle back to where they began. And all the essays spiral round and back and through time. Their movement is less linear than whirl. Considering the hectic pace of my life during the years that I worked on Big Reader, it's no surprise that the writing came in fits and starts. Whenever I could find time, I used to say, as if time might be lurking in the sock drawer or glinting on the pavement like a bit of loose change. Time may have been in short supply, and it usually was, but I kept looking for stray moments. Getting away helped, retreating to a different place. Setting a timer helped. 15 minutes, that's all. The miracle of it was that writing seemed to stretch time or suspend time. Writing became a way of keeping time. To keep, as in to carry out in practice. To keep, as in to guard or defend. Since moving to the West, I've started to write about the trees. It's possible that my writing practice is also becoming more attuned to the natural rhythms of the place I now live. I wrote a photo essay called Pacific Spirit about the Vancouver Park by that name. I took the photos over a period of about a year on my daily walks. Had I attempted to write that piece quickly or on the basis of short acquaintance, it would never have come together. Then again, I made a video essay about the fires that decimated our region this past summer, and I did write that one fast, at a pace that matched the fires. So I'm not yet ready to draw any conclusions, except to say that the way we experience time is inextricable from our experience of space and place, and our work and our practice inevitably reflect this complex interrelationship. My hope is that as a settler living on unceded land, I can begin the process of decolonization in part through a reimagining of time, in which I experience it less as ticking clock and more as a mother tree, rooted in place, growing in whorls, a nurturing presence that branches into a wide sky, seeding itself on the wind through story and song. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Susan. Oh, that was so beautiful. I'm just brimming with delight with everything you guys brought to this panel. Thank you so much. So I've been wildly taking notes as you were talking, and I thought as a way to open up our conversation would be thinking about, you guys have brought up so many interesting images for me and shapes that we can think about in terms of writing and not being tied to the past, not being tied to chronology, but having many more possibilities for that. And my question is, how do we do this in our writing? What are there certain, I don't know if I want to call them techniques even, but how do you signal to your readers that we're entering a different relationship with time? And that could be examples from your own work or from the works of others. And one that comes to mind for me that I teach a lot is the essay First by Ryan Van Meter. And it's written in the present tense, and it starts off in the child's point of view. So we're in, again, that's another aspect of time, right? How old are you? And children experience time very differently. And it takes place in the back of a station wagon, the way back that many of us are familiar with, on a drive home from Little League practice. And it's the first time he realizes he's in love, and he's in love with the little boy sitting next to him. And so he is describing this scene, but then very early on, he says, I'm not sure now if that kid was named Ben, but for now, let's call him Ben, something like that. I'm paraphrasing. And he's the first brown-eyed boy that I've loved, but he won't be the last, right? So right there, and it all happens, I think, in the first paragraph. And so we're in this space-time continuum of the station wagon, and it's a very short amount of time we're going to be with him because it's a quick ride home. But already we're in the future, we're in the past, we're in the present. It's all swirling around right there in this very contained space of the station wagon. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Like, how do you guide your readers into these different relationships with time that they might not be expecting? And don't all jump at once.
I think for me, and I love that essay. I'm glad you brought it up. How he does it is through those eyes, right? So it's the eyes of the boy next to him, but he knows already in the moment, right? It's a future, and also somehow looking back narrator telling us that he loves the eyes next to him. He'll love eyes like that again in the future, right? And so we're all places at once, but we're anchored through the brown eyes. Mm-hmm. And so for me, I think that's once I figure out what the anchor is going to be for a moment, I can situate my reader here, there, and everywhere. But until that happens, things will be a little scattered. And so I allow myself to write the scattered bits, and I keep them, I name them things that are in my folders that are really imaginative, like scattered bits, scattered bits 1, scattered bits 2. And then eventually I figure out what the brown eyes are going to be. And then it all comes together. But I still write it. But you don't have to. I think we get it wrong when we think we have to start with the brown eyes. That doesn't always strike you straight away. So allowing yourself the time to get to there.
Anyone else?
Sorry. I think, a simple way I kind of mentioned in my piece is just with white space, just giving space. And that usually cues the reader that something different is going to happen. But you might not want to do that if what you're trying to do is kind of suggest the continuity of time, or the simultaneity of time, something like that. You might not want to give that space because that kind of suggests a break, perhaps. So yeah, I do think I think what Toni said is really interesting, that if you find one anchoring object, or eyes aren't really an object, but one anchoring detail, that is a way of kind of moving the reader through, for sure. Yeah.
I think another way too is the layering and how they get layered within that space. So whether you're using white space to create that, to indicate you're in a new layer, or italics, or whatever you might use, that you're now moving into a different space. But the layers of time within an essay around a focal point. I think everything what everyone's saying is accurate. But for me, I think a lot of it is the layering, just making sure that it indicates we're now in a different space and a different time.
Yeah, I think similarly, I've been thinking so much about how time is relational, and these vessels are relational, however we hold the time. But, Susan was saying time and place are inextricable for her. Toni was mentioning that. Brenda, in your essay, The Fine Art of Containment, you talk about Brian Van Meter's essay and the space of the car as a way of holding time, this container scene. But the boy, the Ben, maybe not Ben, he's this beautiful body that will also be like other beautiful bodies to come. And so we get that like mirror effect of time, because time is also related to something else. And in fiction, a lot of times that's also through point of view, which we might see less of in nonfiction, except that this was a lovely example also, the Van Meter essay, of how point of view can be that little trick, that little relational thing with time as well.
Yeah, I was going to mention when Toni was reading, I noticed the second person point of view there. And I started thinking, oh, yeah, point of view is very tied to the time that we're being asked to enter, because the narrator is in kind of two places or more at once. And then Toni also brought in geologic time at the end. So, some things are subtle in that way where a casual reader might not notice. But once we're kind of being more self-conscious about what we're up to, we can maybe start using these tools for certain effects. Susan, you talked about syntax, right? And just the way a sentence can really slow down or speed up our experience of time and place. Thank you. Another great writer who does this is Bernard Cooper, who some of you know very well. And he's constantly using phrases such as, I don't yet know, right? So, or I wouldn't yet know, or I won't know until years later, right? So again, just allowing yourself and your narrative personas to be in more than one place at once, and to not always be looking back or just right here in the present, but also what can you prophesize for the future. All right. So let's see. Oh, and Susan, you mentioned video essays. Can you talk a little bit more about your video essay? And because it seems like that kind of form, it gives you so many more tools to work with in terms of time, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've only made one, so I'm hardly an expert. But I was drawn to the form, I guess, just as an experiment. I just wanted to see what it would be like, and now we all have, cameras that we have the technology, and so I decided I'd make one over the summer, and I was able to go on a retreat to Saskatchewan. Actually, there's a monastery there that hosts writers and artists on a regular basis. So I was there for a couple of weeks, and I don't know what I thought I was going to do this thing on, but when I arrived, the place was, I mean, the air quality was, it was worse than Beijing. You couldn't breathe. And it was the smoke from the fires in the boreal forest to the north. So I just was so struck by this. And there's nothing else there's no other subject when you're in a situation like that. And so it was wonderful, though, to be able to make use of sound and image as well as text simultaneously, music, image, and all of these things flowing together. So it was really fun to do it. And I think increasingly in my essays, I've been wanting to achieve that kind of layering, more and more and more of it. And in writing, it can get over complex if you're not careful. And so, or perhaps very, very, very skilled. And so I just found it a really interesting experiment, and who knows where it'll go. I don't know.
Yeah, right now I'm teaching, or I just finished teaching my class on autobiography and photography, and using photographic images in your work is another form of time travel. And Rebecca, I know that there's a very significant photo that you've worked with, right? Maybe talk about that a little bit. And plus, you talked about just finding that clipping as well, right? So all these artifacts that actually transport us, right, to different times and places.
Yeah, and I mean, I was thinking that when Susan started talking about the video, it's just another way of capturing time in an image, right? Like, so, how a photo creates that same thing, right? That you're seeing time right in front of you, but it's static, or now in a video, you're seeing it like move, but it's still a glimpse of time. So yeah, my book that I mentioned, it all has photos in it, but there was one in particular that was of my great grandmother that I found and had traveled the world with me, had lived in Auckland for several years and everywhere else I've been. And I totally forgot about it, and I didn't remember who it was. It was just some, old photo that was given to me. And when I pulled it out, I just saw myself in that space. And like, it was me looking at me from, ages ago. So that was a real, big moment to see myself, because as I mentioned in my book, like I I didn't have any family members around me that looked like me. And that was something that people would always comment on. Like, you don't look like your siblings. You don't look like your parents. Like, where do you belong? And I found out later I belonged to the women that were gone, and they all died before I was born. And so I never got to see myself, at a family reunion or see myself reflected back. And I just think that's also, how time changes how we look as well, as we age, and then going back and looking at photos. And so this photo of my great grandmother that was given to me when I was a teenager, I think when someone mentioned that she kind of looked like me, I didn't see it at the time, right? Like, I didn't see it, but it was looking back at myself at that age and her at that age, like in our 20s, was pretty incredible. So it's interesting how we hold time in various things, whether it's objects, which was kind of talked about in some of the panels yesterday, or in, images or videos.
Yes, thank you, Rebecca. And I'm thinking about layering too, and how with writing, I mean, it can feel like we're just so caught in writing just in lines across the page, but Tiana and Toni and so many of you have talked about different shapes that we can use, but is there a way, could we actually put those shapes on the page? I'm just trying to envision, like, how can we bring that forward more if we want to resist the linearity of the written sentence? Dad, do you have any examples of that? Have you seen people doing that?
We see it sometimes. Sorry, Kristiana.
No, go ahead, Susan.
Now they both shut up. Tiana, you go next.
Okay. I was thinking for my essay Marked, which was published in Hunger Mountain, and talks about tattooing, they actually paired me with I think graduate student artist who created, it was, I mean, very purposely not oceanic or Hawaiian tattoos that would have gone against the purpose of the essay, but these prints that were from her cultural context and these markings, and so the visual layout was stunning, and echoed against what the piece was about. So I felt that also, that collaboration seemed one way to go, and how I know several of you collaborate when writing, and I think it was particularly wonderful to collaborate with an artist.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Susan?
I was just thinking about, I mean, you'd see it in concrete poetry all the time, right? So it's just a little more difficult to imagine it in with a longer form, because how do you lay it out, and how does the reader experience it? But I think you can do it. I mean, I'm thinking now of Jenny Booley's The Book of Beginning and Ending, right? Like, so that there's a lot of blank space and a lot of footnotes. And so that's one way of playing with the actual space on the page, as well as to indicate something about time, I think. So we can probably do it more than maybe we do, but I'm not sure to what degree we can do it. It's an interesting question, though. I'd love to hear from other people about it.
Well, I feel like it's kind of where we're headed in creative nonfiction these days, is experimenting more with the actual structures and forms and hybridity. A few things have come to mind as you were talking. It's Rebecca Solnit, and I believe it's her book called The Faraway Nearby. I might have that wrong, though, but the main narrative is happening up here, and then the footnotes is another narrative that's happening simultaneously, but in a different time and perspective, right? So that's one way, and it demands a lot from the reader. Like, how do I read this? How do I read this, right? And then this is slightly different, but Ross Gay in his Book of Delights has a piece where he's musing on the fact that Blackness is often equated with suffering. And he starts repeating those words, and then they actually are on top of one another for a few lines. And it's so powerful. Now, I don't know if you could do that for a whole book, right? But again, just these little moments where the text itself is breaking free of the structures that are traditional. And then one more is Bow Down by Karen Green. Do you know that book? It's Bough, Bow Down. And it's about her husband, who was David Foster Wallace, and his suicide and the aftermath. And she's also an artist and a poet. And most of the book are these beautiful collages, like pictures of her collages that's all jumbled up, and then just fragments of the writing that happen in all different times and spaces. And so you just have to immerse yourself in it. And it's not going to be that same traditional kind of reading experience that we're expecting. Okay, we have
Brenda, sorry,
yes.
I just wanted to give one more example because I was thinking of Craig Santos Perez, and he makes what he calls poem maps, but they are also, I think, essays in certain ways, and they visually trace the paths of U.S. Military bases, and so that it is a poem and a map. It's a poem map, right? And so Luke Howe is probably the best example, or the most collected example of the present, but that visual representation there, an entire kind of history in word and image.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, we have a few more minutes if we want to turn it over to any audience questions or comments that you have. I see a lot of wonderful comments about our panel, so thank you very much. I'm not seeing questions per se yet. So if there are any questions or anything you wish to discuss in the chat, let us know. I'll give you a minute. We have all the time in the world. What is time? Anything more about specific techniques, of course, and especially like, how do you teach them too? Like, how do you teach your students to deliberately use techniques? It's always a kind of a balancing game for me, because I know once we get too self-conscious about what we're doing, that can actually kind of inhibit you and make the writing kind of stilted. So how do you teach using time in ways they might not have thought of? And maybe it's in the drafting, or maybe it's in the revision process. Any thoughts on that?
I'm just going to jump in and kind of go to kind of what Toni said about the anchor, is that often it's in the editing process or in the reworking of everything to see how you can move time around in your pieces, in your essays, and like how they get organized to indicate time and the movement of time. So I think sometimes we write very linearly, and then we go back and we like mix it all up and kind of put it back in that spiral, or we write all over the place and then try to bring it back into the linear. So I think a lot of it is just in the editing process is a tool to teach.
Yeah, and I'll go back to what I said in my talk too. I think it's anchored to place a lot. So, I mean, if you do have a student who's kind of all over the place, so to speak, but all over the place in time, and you can't sort of figure out what's going on, that's maybe a question, right? Where are you right now in this moment in the piece? And then you can kind of encourage them to at least think about that and think about how they want to present themselves.
Yeah, and Anne in the chat is making the comment, when I've tried this, I end up with a big confusing mess. And I'd say that's great. I think Rebecca McClanahan is still here. If she is, Rebecca has a wonderful term called the messay. And I use that with my students all the time. Hi, Rebecca. I just love the messay, right? And it just gives you so much permission to make a mess, like a kid does when they're playing, right? If you told a kid, don't make a mess while you're playing, they're not going to have too good a time, right? So make a mess. And because often it's in that mess that the real subject will come out, maybe not the one you intended. it's the one where the images like eyes, or whatever will come out that you weren't intending, right? So it gives the intuition a place to come out and play, the messe. I know, we should make t-shirts. Also, another technique is point of view, like we saw with Toni's piece, right? So I might ask students to, try writing it in the second person, or especially with the photography class, the third person. And if it's a picture of yourself, say, that girl in the photo, what is she thinking? What's going to happen, after this photo is taken, right? So then, you get all these different distances, which also is related to time, to your material in that way. All right, we have just about 3 more minutes. Anything else that anyone would like to add before we go? It's been really fun, and I want to see all of your talks on the page. I'm hoping that I'll get the chance to do that, and I don't know, maybe we can have a compilation of talks from Nonfiction now for everyone to see. All right. Well, if there aren't any other questions, we'll just go ahead and conclude our panel. And thank you to my panelists, and thank you to everyone who was here today, and enjoy the rest of your conference today and tomorrow. It's been so much fun. I feel like we kind of are here together in time and space.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. I so enjoyed all your talks.
Oh, really? I do want to see all of them. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, a lot of good material for teaching and reading for my own writing. It really inspired me, especially thinking about geologic time. It's something that I think I've neglected. And that might do a jump start for some of my writing. And thinking about shapes too, and not necessarily while I'm drafting, but when I'm revising, thinking what shape would I picture this in? Yeah. And I don't know that essay, Picturing, or is it a book? Picturing the Personal Essay. That sounds wonderful.
I'm muted. It's
Yeah.
on. It's on Creative Nonfiction's website, and you can just take a look at it. And it's sort of. I mean, they aren't maps so much as abstractions of the shape that he imagines these. He looks at specific examples of essays, and of course, you might disagree with the way he, constructs them, but that's really interesting for students too, if they've read the essay, to then go and look at it and say, oh, I don't see it that way at all. I see it a different way. Yeah.
Right. And I've done that with students with Bernard Cooper's truth serum. We try to map it and picture it, and it's almost impossible because it just goes so many different time frames. Yeah.
Well, we actually tried with Anne Panning's Remembering I Was Not There, which is a really great one to use because it's short, right? But it's so complicated. And oh my gosh, they had trouble with that too.
Well, hopefully it's a fun challenge. All right. So I don't know if we just leave or if we get like booted out. Is our wonderful digital moderator here? All right. Well, thank you. And I'll just say goodbye and leave the room and maybe see you later. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Gia. Okay. Oops, how do we get out? Leave. Leave.